In the next half an hour, we're going to cover the .NET code model, and we'll show you exactly what are the different pieces of the .NET code model so that you can build great applications with .NET. We will open up for questions after the presentation and then answer all of your questions after that. We'll also show you exactly how IronSpeed Designer meets some of these best practices that we will outline as we go over the .NET code model. So let's get started immediately. So the first part of it is what exactly or how exactly is the .NET code model structured? Let's go dive down deep into the code and let's look at exactly what that looks like effectively. When you're looking at .NET technologies, in many ways it's very similar to if you have been familiar with some of the other technologies like Java and PHP and so on. You've got essentially a code file effectively which is can combine the simplest model is essentially something called a single file page model. It combines the layout, the look and feel, the HTML essentially, with the code, with essentially all of the events that you need to handle in order to do your work. And that it gets combined into one ASPX file. So if you look at this particular page that I have, a sample application that I have shown you over here, at the bottom you see all of the HTML that makes up the particular page. And within that, you've got some ASP controls like ASP:label or ASP:button, for example, which then eventually will get translated into the appropriate HTML controls. At the top, you've got essentially a click handler for the button effectively, which does some additional work effectively. So this is the simplest .NET code model that you can use, which combines essentially all of the code and the layout into one thing effectively. Now, this is primarily used for the simplest of applications, so obviously we don't want to spend a whole lot of time over here. Let's go to the next step over here, which is essentially a combination of essentially a pair of files that make up essentially a page to display .NET pages on the web. This is called the code behind page model. There is a code behind file essentially. And this is the most common in practice. Typically, you might see something like a .aspx file, like in this example that I'm showing you to the right. You've got showOrders.aspx, and then there is a VB or C# or some other file that corresponds to the code behind that is also included. These two files go hand in hand. This is the most common in practice, and the biggest benefit of that is it separates the layout and the code into two different files. So your graphic designers and others can focus on the layout portion of the code to make it look pretty. And then the code is where the developers can go in and actually write the code in order to handle all of the events and everything else that goes beyond it. The layout is in the ASPX, and of course the code behind is in VB or C#. There is no performance difference per se between the single file page model versus the dual page model. It works exactly the same thing. The benefit of this thing is that now you have the ability to reuse a bunch of common code effectively, because the code behind file can essentially use code that is coming from other files very easily, because it's just like any other development project that you have built. And then as we talked about, designers can focus on the design and the look and feel while the developers can write code. And this is what we would recommend as the best practice for an N-tier application. Let's go back and talk about how does this hookup actually happen? How does .NET really know that there is a code behind file that corresponds to the .aspx? So if I were to look at the .aspx file, there is some amount of preamble that shows up at the top of that code file, like for example the add register tags and the add page tag. And one of those attributes in the add page tag is something called code file that refers to that particular code file by name. That's how the hookup. Now, normally when you're using Visual Studio or other products, this code file attribute is automatically specified, so you don't have to worry about that. But underneath the hood, that's how the hookup actually occurs effectively. And then the file itself, in terms of the code file itself, you will see that it is a page class that is derived from the .NET page class. It could be another subclass of the page class, like for example, in this example, there is a base application page, which is an intermediate class between the show categories table page as well as the and the page class from the .NET library. Okay, so what is the best practice here? In our recommendation, we suggest that you use the code behind page model for extensibility, that you do not use the single file model. Let's now go through the page lifecycle. What exactly happens when a page is displayed? What are the nitty-gritty details essentially behind the scenes that essentially happen in order to display that page on the web browser effectively? Well, each page goes through what's called a page lifecycle. It essentially comes into being, it does a variety of steps effectively, and then eventually it disappears effectively once the page is being rendered on the browser effectively. So it goes through the sequence of steps. What are some of the sequence of steps it goes through? It goes through initialization, loads all of the user interface control that you might have, for example. If you read in that particular page, if it's hooked up to the database, it reads the data from the database. And then it populates the user interface control. So essentially, let's say you're reading a customer record, you read that record, and then you've got a first name field. Now you need to populate that first name field from the database control. And then, of course, you display the page. Later on, users may take some action, like, for example, they may press the save button or things of that nature, or next page or previous page and so on. And in that case, a number of additional things could happen, like you may have to do validation, you may have to do save data into database and redirect back to the calling page and so on and so forth effectively. Now, what does .NET give you, and what can we do in terms of this page lifecycle? What .NET does effectively, it takes care of loading all of the page, and it converts the ASPX controls that you have into HTML controls. At the end of the day, the browser only understands the HTML controls effectively. It'll only understand the href tag or the input tag and so on. It does not recognize the ASP: text box or ASP: button, for example. So somehow or other, these controls have to be translated into HTML controls. And that's the job of the .NET framework and the job of IIS in order to handle that. And then it essentially renders the controls on the page in order for display purposes. Now, where do we hook up? Where can we step in and do our job effectively if we were to do that thing? Well, the way .NET works is that it raises various events for you to do your work. Events that essentially allow you to kind of piggyback on those events, saying, oh, .NET will say, I'm done initializing the page. Do you need to do anything? I'm done loading the data. Do you need to do anything? And that's where your job or my job essentially is to handle these various events in order to load this data from the database and then do any other business processing that we need to do in order to handle our code effectively. So if you look at the basic event model for .NET, really it's very simple. There's only 3 events that really matter. There are actually a couple of other very low-level events that 99.9% of the time you're never going to be using at all, like page unload and so on. In this particular case, those 3 events are the init, the load, and the pre-render. Every page will receive these 3 events. You can choose to handle them, or you can choose to ignore them. That's up to you effectively. And the way that we develop essentially the code for a .NET application is we handle these events in order to do our work effectively. For the simplest of the pages, many of them may just be plain old display, and that's the end of it. So these events are, you would essentially write an event handler, and then effectively handle these events essentially. So init essentially creates all the controls and initializes them, as you might expect, when this event is called. So you can essentially handle it and do any post-initialization process that you may want to do. The load event is sent essentially to give you an opportunity to load the data from the database. You don't want to load the database in the init method or the pre-render. You want to load it appropriately in the load method effectively, so that the data can essentially be read from the database and then bound to the user interface controls. And finally, the pre-render event is called, and this is really just before the page is being displayed on the browser. the .NET gives you an opportunity to do any last-minute adjustment on the page after all the data is loaded and so on. And that's where the pre-render comes in place. Now, this particular event model that you see is primarily for the first-time display of pages. We'll go through and talk about a little bit about Postback in a minute over here. Now, let me give you an example of what happens for this, calling hierarchy. If you look at an Iron Speed Designer application, what we do is when we generate your application, we handle these three events, the init, the load, and the pre-render, and then we call other functions inside of there in order to do additional work. As an example, the load method calls authorize, and authorize does its job of essentially checking to make sure that this page is really, the user who's using this page does have privileges in order to view this page. The authorize is a function that we wrote. It's not a .NET function, but it's called from the .NET load event handler effectively. And then following authorize, we actually call something called a load data, again, a specific function that we generate, which actually loads the data from the database effectively. So this is a typical example of a calling hierarchy when a page is being displayed on the browser. Now, what happens is that was what we talked about was for the initial display of the page. Now, what happens is after the page is displayed, this is very important to remember. The server releases the page instance. There is no page instance in memory at that point in time. So if you kept a variable, let's say, for example, you say, I equal 37, well, guess what? After the browser displays that page on the end user's computer, on the end user system, that page instance no longer remains in memory. It's gone, completely gone. So what you have to do is nothing about this page or the data on the page is kept on the server effectively. Now, the way .NET works effectively is that it uses something called a ViewState. ViewState is where all of the state information is maintained essentially for you in this ViewState. You have an opportunity to deposit something in ViewState if you like in any of those event handlers that we talked about, like, for example, the pre-render and so on, so that if the page comes back later on because the user presses some button, you will have access to that variable as an example. This is by far the single biggest mistake that .NET developers do. They don't realize that the page effectively is gone once the page is essentially displayed effectively. So what is a postback? A postback is something where a user's action on the screen causes a postback. So as an example, the user presses the save button. That's a typical thing that you might think about. But it could also be a variety of other things. Could be the next page button, the previous page button. It could be another button like, okay, I want to view something, I want to filter something, and so on. When the user takes an action, an event is raised, and this page is essentially posted back to the server. This is where the page instance is recreated effectively. So essentially, the page instance now comes back into being once the user takes some action effectively. In this particular case, what happens is the user interface control data is repopulated from the ViewState, and this is done for you automatically by .NET, so that when you do the things like me.firstname.text as an example, you have access to what the user typed in on that first name text box as an example. In C#, it would be this.firstname.text. And then the server-side event handler is called after all of this is done, so that this is where you have an opportunity to then handle that event essentially. And I showed you a number of examples like button click essentially, and so when the user changes a drop-down, or if the user changes a text box and you created a handler effectively in order to handle that. Remember that you must register an event handler to request a postback. Now, some of the IDE development environments will automatically register the event handlers for you. But if you don't register an event handler, you're not going to get a postback effectively. This is true for button clicks. This is true for any of those things as well. It's much easier to do in Visual Basic.NET because you can use the handles keyword after the function name. In C#, you have to explicitly register that event handler. So in the case of Postback, the page lifecycle is slightly different. Instead of 3 events, there are 4 events that are actually sent by .NET effectively. In addition to the init, load, and pre-render, you actually have this specific event handler that you registered effectively. Init and load will do exactly the same thing that they were doing before, and so will pre-render. Only additional work is being essentially done by the event handler that you've got essentially here. And so what does that look like? If you were to look like a typical page as an example, here is the handling of what we call the save button essentially on a particular page. So the init and the load gets called and they do their work, and then the click handler for the button gets called in order to do our work. What we can do is essentially handle that event, and then we can save this data effectively by essentially calling our own internal function like save data and so on. And finally, a pre-render is done. Now, the save data function may redirect after saving within that function. So it may say once that data is saved, it may redirect back to the previous page or redirect to a different page as an example. It could essentially not redirect, and then if you fall through that function, it'll go back and refresh that page again. So that choice of redirection or not is in the click handler effectively, or in the event handler that you've got essentially. Okay. Now, one of the key things that you need to do in order to make sure that the performance is appropriate is always check what's called the isPostback flag effectively in order to determine whether this is the first time the page is being displayed or whether this is in a postback effectively. And one of the key things is that when you're loading data from the database, only load the data during the initial display, because subsequently the data is already in the view state and will already be available to you. There's no need for you to reload the data from the database in normal circumstances. Of course, there may be exceptions to that because you need to do some other validation, other things, so you may need to load additional data. So typically the code would look like this. If not is postback, then that would essentially be the initial page display. And if it is postback, then you've got code that needs to be only executed during the postback effectively. Okay? Now let's talk about state management. You see all of the gibberish here at the bottom effectively. That is what ViewState is. It's a standard feature of .NET. It's by default, it maintains this information in the HTML sent to the browser. So if you take any ASPX page and right mouse click that, you will see a hidden variable called __ViewState, which contains all of this ViewState. Now keep in mind that this data is encoded, but it's not encrypted. I can copy this data effectively from any page here, and then effectively go to one of the many sites that does ViewState decoding effectively, if you just search for ViewState decoding, and then paste that gibberish over there, and it'll turn into nicely formatted XML effectively, which is how all of the ViewState is displayed. So keep in mind that if you put some data in there, like for example, let's say you put in a, obviously you wouldn't want to do it, but if you put in a credit card number in a variable on the page effectively, and you want to put it into a ViewState, that information will then be available in this encoded but not encrypted ViewState, and it's easily decoded effectively. So you don't want to do anything which is not something that you want to keep a secret effectively of that data. ViewState, .NET allows maintenance of that ViewState to be saved in either the session, the cache, a file, or a database. But, and there's a big but effectively on this one, that you have to do some additional work, maybe change certain things in your web.config file. And you also need to make sure that you provide the appropriate file or database links in order to save that. One of the biggest negatives of a ViewState in a page is that it bloats the page. because the page now becomes larger effectively. But one of the disadvantages effectively of saving it into a session or a cache is that session or cache can get timed out basically. So as an example, let's say 100,000 users are hitting your web server and you only have 10 gig of memory. Well, what will happen is your session will get timed out after 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever else. So if you were to save that view state, when the user comes back, when the user presses the save button as an example, he may find out that, oh, sorry, view state has been flushed out from the session, and now he has to redo his work. So that's why even though, and then if you of course save it in the file or database, it requires regular cleanup effectively. So even though the page is bloated, our recommendation would be to actually leave the view state in the page rather than actually doing it in a session or cache or other things basically. So just to summarize, on the page lifecycle, we recommend that you do most of the work by handling the load event. The init should be only used for initializing event handlers effectively. C#, you have to do more work in the init handlers than VB.NET, but generally the load event is where you want to do all of the work. And then pre-render really only is used to handle any dependent controls effectively at that point in time. Security for a page should be checked in the load. The reason for that is that at the time of init, not all of the data is initialized, not all of the controls are initialized, and you may not have access to all of the things available there. So that's why we recommend that you check it in the load event effectively. And of course, we recommend using Postback extensively so that you actually minimize loading of the data. And then, of course, as we just talked about, using the page view state. Okay, let's talk about AJAX. AJAX, of course, is very popular now and essentially allows you to create flicker-free updates on your page, essentially. So you can look at the page fast and see it very quickly update without having to refresh the entire page effectively. In .NET, Microsoft has done a great job of effectively creating a very simple to implement. So what you can do is you can just surround the .NET controls with ASP:\updatePanel, as you can see in this particular thing. And then essentially anything that happens inside of that section effectively, inside of that content template, will get refreshed only for that particular section rather than the entire page effectively. And Microsoft .NET takes care of essentially making sure that only the content that has changed is retrieved back, and then browser only paints this changed content effectively. Okay? And you can have multiple and or nested update panels. So you can effectively say that, here is an update panel for this section of the page, and here's another update panel for another section of the page. You can have as many of them as you want, and you can even nest them as necessary effectively. And the beauty of this thing is that the rest of your code, in terms of your code behind, does not change when you use AJAX. The code behinds work exactly the same way without you having to do anything more. You can also show what's called an UpdateProgress, essentially something going round and round, essentially to show that, hey, there's something happening over there. And here's how you can essentially hook up an animated image in order to show that update progress effectively. Okay. What we recommend in terms of AJAX is to use a single update panel. Well, the reason for that is that if you have any dependent controls, using multiple update panels, especially which are not nested, will require you to do special handling when updating dependent information. So if panel 1 changes, you may have to change panel 2, for example. Let's say if you have a master record at the top, detail at the bottom, you don't want to put them into 2 update panels. You want to put them into 1 update panel, because when the master record changes, the detail also has to change for the different masters, as an example. Okay, let's talk about master pages. Master pages is a .NET concept effectively, which allows you to essentially create a hierarchy for your layout, essentially. So hierarchy in the sense that you can say, just like in code, you inherit a class, and you say this page class or this particular show categories page derives from the base application page, which derives from the page .NET page class, you have a similar concept for the layout portion of it. And that is essentially what the concept of a master page is. It allows you to create a consistent layout. So what you can do is effectively say, each one of my page will focus only on the content that is specific to that page, and everything else around it, like the header, the menu, the footer, and so on, will go into a master page. So if you change the master page, your entire application changes very quickly, effectively. So it centralizes the common functionality, and it's much easier to use. So the typical use is that the master page inherits or contains all of the styles, CSS styles, the header, footer, and menu, and the individual page simply contains the specific content that goes along with that. So an example over here is a page where you might see the header, Acme, and the menu, the orders, employees, customers, and so on, in the green, essentially, border, as well as at the bottom where you've got the footer in the green border is part of the master page, while the red bordered thing is actually part of the content. Now, it doesn't need to be this way, essentially, in terms of vertical. You could essentially have on the left-hand side, essentially, another menu or another control or anything else, and that could be part of the master page as well. So this is just one example of that. Master page, essentially what happens is the way that you see the way the master page looks like is that you essentially define a page and put an @master tag on it. And then it looks like regular HTML, essentially, so you might see essentially other table TRTD tags. And finally, you have something called a content placeholder. .NET will replace this content placeholder with the content from each page, effectively. That's how master pages work, effectively. And master pages can inherit from other master pages. So you can actually have a hierarchy of master pages available there as well. So to summarize, what are the best practices for master pages? We recommend that you create multiple master pages for different needs. So you might have a need to say, here's a standard page for web applications, but here's another master page that is only used when you are printing, for example, in which case you would want to delete all of your other junk from the pages and just show what is absolutely necessary. And maybe you have another page for email and so on. Okay, and nest master pages if needed. And our recommendation is also to include all of the CSS styles, JavaScript, etc., that is common across the application into the master pages so that the page content is focused on actual data. Got a few more slides over here. I know we're running into about half an hour over here, but I will stay on as long as necessary to answer any questions that you might have. So go ahead and send those questions into Jo, and she'll print them out and have them ready for me to read and answer. Let's talk about an N-tier application. Well, our recommendation, just like any other development environment that you might use, is to divide your application into N tiers effectively. You can essentially create ASPX pages, and essentially that would be where the UI effectively is going to be. Your code behind files are going to be in the UI code is going to be in the code behind files effectively for each one of the ASPX pages. And then, of course, as you might imagine, you have a business layer, a data access layer, and stored procedures effectively. So a typical application might look like this, for example, where you've got the web pages effectively, and though that constitutes essentially all of your UI layer. But in addition to that, in the presentation layer, you have all of the code related to security, you have the code related to validation, you have the code related to any of the user interface controls, and so on, export, import, and things of that nature that you need to do. The business layer is where you're going to do the bulk of your work effectively in terms of essentially handling things that are common across the entire application. And then the data access layer handles all of the things related to essentially accessing the data. That includes not only reading and writing the data, but transaction management essentially, connection management. You need to essentially make sure that there is also caching going on potentially in order to improve performance. And everything related to that is handled at the data access layer. And then, of course, at the database layer is where you would effectively have the stored procedures essentially. So in order to get best performance, if your database server is on another machine, you want to do as much of the querying inside of stored procedures so that it runs inside of the database rather than on your application server effectively. So what are the best practices for an N-tier application? Well, the key thing, as you might imagine, is that changes to the layout should not impact code behind. So if I move a button from one location to another location, should not impact code behind at all. And the changes to the database schema should also have a minimal impact on the UI layer, because what you want to do is essentially insulate the database schema from the UI layer. So you want to be able to make sure that if there's something that changes on the database layer, does not have an impact on the UI. Data access layer, we always recommend that must use strongly typed objects. So if you've got a date field in your database, it should be a date object in the data access layer, not a string object effectively, right? Because that's why it needs to be strongly typed. A money should be the appropriate money unit, and then similarly the ints and longs and doubles and decimals and so on and so forth. That's the reason why we recommend using a data access layer that gives you strongly typed objects, so that some of the errors that can be made effectively while developing can be actually handled by the compiler, rather than you having to wait till essentially the end user uses it and types something incorrectly, or essentially has something incorrect in the database that gives you a crash effectively of the application. Another important concept is that paging must be done in the database, not in memory. If you use the regular grid view or something like that in .NET, unfortunately, these do paging in memory, not in the database. So if you've got 1 million records effectively and you want to view the 37th page of 10 records, the problem is the grid view essentially has to retrieve everything from the database and then essentially pick out the 37th page of 10 records each. That is a very key part, and you need to write extra code in order to essentially make sure that paging is done in the database, not in memory effectively. Also, one of the key things is to make sure that concurrency is handled appropriately. The web applications, by their very nature, are asynchronous. So you send a page and then you wait till the user responds, or the user may never respond effectively. So you cannot lock that record. You have to use what's called optimistic concurrency effectively, which means essentially that you wait till the user updates rather than pessimistic concurrency, which is where you would lock the record automatically before you display the page, essentially. So these are some of the things that you have to worry about in N-tier applications as you're developing your applications. Let's talk a little bit about IronSpeed Designer. Obviously, that's what you might expect, being a webinar coming from IronSpeed. Let me tell you that IronSpeed Designer handles all of the best practices we have talked about over here, in terms of the .NET code model, in terms of the page lifecycle, AJAX, master pages, and N-tier applications that we talked about here. What it allows you to do, it generates essentially an application which follows all of these best practices in here and lets you focus on what is most important effectively in your application. Every data-centric web application will have the same type of things that you need to do. You need to slice and dice the information and display it in an appropriate format. You need to report on that information. You need to filter that. You need to sort it. You need to search it. You need to do all of those things. You need to add the data, delete the data, update the data, and so on and so forth. What IronSpeed Designer does is gives you a standard cookie cutter application for handling those things, and then leaves you with only the 5 or 10 or 15% of your application where you can do your value added, which is you can bring about the final finishing touches to make it look, make that look exactly as you need. You know, I give the example of Home Depot or Lowe's hardware store sometimes, where I say, today you can go out and buy every piece of the house that you need to build from the hardware store. You can buy the cement for the foundation, you can buy the rebar, you can buy the 2x4s, and you can buy the electrical outlets and the roofing material and everything that you need at the local hardware store. Rather than you building that house, what we recommend is let us build that house for you. And what you need to do is make that into a home. How do you make it into a home? You personalize it. You choose the colors you want, the hardwood floor, the furniture that you want effectively, the nice paintings on the wall that you want to make it into a home that is unique and specific to yourself effectively, right? Let us build a house for you, and then you make that house into a home. That is where IronSpeed Designer comes in effectively in order to give you what you need essentially with that basic house so that you can just focus on the specific things that you are really good at effectively, okay? So one of the key things that we have done, or actually 3 key things that we did in recent releases, especially in version 7.x, is that we actually created 3 game-changing enhancements effectively. We created something called a spreadsheet grid in order to modify your layout. Spreadsheet grid allows you to zoom in or zoom out to any section of the page and allows you to modify that. If you know how to use Excel, you know how to create a nice looking page without actually having down into HTML or ASPX. Same thing what we've done with the toolbox. Instead of you dragging and dropping an ASP colon text box or ASP colon literal, what we have done is given you a toolbox which has pre-configured panels and controls. So rather than dragging and dropping an ASP text box, you drag and drop a first name field as an example. Rather than dragging and dropping a first name field, you drag and drop a add customer panel. So rather than writing code one line at a time, one control at a time, you do the work one panel or one page at a time. That gives you a tremendous amount of productivity improvement effectively. And then finally, in a third area where you need to actually customize. So for example, let's say you have a birth date field. You want to validate to make sure that the birth date is not in the future as an example, right? Well, guess what? How can you do that? Well, we have created an Excel-like formula formulas in version 7.x which make it a breeze in order to actually make those kind of validations and those kind of business layer extensions without having to dive down into code. The end result of that is that you get essentially a great looking product without having to do a whole lot of essentially work. So just as we talked about a little earlier, page layout allows you to essentially drag and drop controls, move them along, don't have to know any HTML or ASPX. And then you can use what's called a cell editor in order to essentially do fine-grained tuning, like change the background color, bold it, italic, and so on, without having to worry about knowing any of the HTML. And similarly, as we talked about the toolbox controls, you can drag and drop fields or panels. And then finally, on the formula language, which is an Excel-like, and most common tasks can be done over here without you having to actually dive down into VB.NET or C#. Certainly, you have 100% of the source code available for your application so that if you do need, you can open it up in Visual Studio and go for that as well. So at the bottom line is, what is your time worth effectively? And what is the return on investment? Those are the key questions that you need to ask. Certainly, the .NET code model that we talked about is certainly available to you and valuable to you, but you have to take care of all of the little details. Why not focus your energy on the things that actually make that application into your application effectively? And that's why we can essentially deliver to you an application without you having to worry about the ASPX and the code level effectively. Gets you at a much higher level. All right, with that, I will take questions, and I'll stay on as long as necessary to answer your questions. Looks like you've been a busy bunch. I already have about, I don't know, 25 or 30 questions over here. Let me take a sip of water, and I'll be right back. All right, so Eric is asking, does IronSpeed generate one routine that is used by all records as an event handler when a user clicks on the view icon for any record? The answer to that question is no. IronSpeed Designer, because every record is different effectively, the view page for every type of record, like customer's record and the category's record, would be different. So what we do effectively is we generate essentially a specific thing for each one of the different pages. Okay. John is asking, do you have any examples showing how an IronSpeed application app can incorporate the use of web service or an API that might be provided by a third party? John, absolutely. If you go to the code customization wizard in the Customize menu, you can see, and there's a web service section, and you'll be able to see an example of essentially both consuming a web service and publishing a web service as well. Robert is asking, how do you set session or cache timeout? Is that page level, application level, server level, etc.? Robert, that is actually at the application level. It's at the web.config level. If you search for timeout or session or cache, you'll be able to see that in your web.config here. Let me see if I can find it effectively. Let me see if I can find an application over here. And if I go to web.config and open it up in there, if you look for timeout, you will see essentially, there you have it essentially. You have a session state, and the session state timeout is 60 seconds, I believe. That's how it is specified over there. You might actually, there is actually, if you search for session state in our knowledge base, by just going to ironspeed.com/kb, you'll be able to see that. John is asking, is it possible to create submenus when using the Everest theme with classic menu style? Absolutely, John. You can just simply go into IronSpeed Designer and create as many submenus as you want. Effectively, if you had an application that was open up, bring up the menu wizard from the tools, and then you can essentially drag and drop. So here's an example where I'm, instead of creating, I'm just going to drag and drop and move it below. So here is, three level deep things. So under orders menu, I've got employees menu, and under the employees menu, I've got customers menu. So you can create as many sub-levels as you want. David is asking, can you define more than one master page? Absolutely, you can, David, and you can actually create essentially nested master pages as well. If you need additional help, and if you have support, contact us through support, and we can actually guide you towards that. I'm sure there's also online help available in terms of nesting master pages that you might benefit from as well. What is registering events? Prakayat is asking, how is this done? Prakayat, the nesting of the, the registering of the events is actually done differently in VB versus C#. Let me actually go into what's called the controls file over here. I'm looking at a show categories table page over here. So the typical show categories page is displaying all of the categories, as you might imagine, from the Southwind database. So you know that you have a lot of buttons. Like, for example, you have a button like the view button, the export button, the new button, and so on. In order to handle those as events, essentially, meaning that you need to write the button click handler, you need to register. So if I go into the controls file and I'm looking at the code, you will notice that this is how, first of all, in the constructor for each row, I create a new event handler for the init. So remember we talked about the 3 events that we handle, the init, the load, and the pre-render? This is how you register an event. Now in VB.NET, this is done in a slightly different way. Let me see if I can show you from a different application a VB code. Let's see if I go to maybe my F47 categories. No, this is also C#. Categories. Okay, there you go. So I'm looking at the same show categories table.vb, controls.vb. So I'm going to open that up. And notice the difference basically is that here there is no constructor over here, but instead in VB you specify this handles keyword. So same thing, control init has a handles mybase.init effectively, and that's how you specify an event handler for init. The difference is VB in C# is in C# you would actually need to essentially create that new handler and add it to the event handler effectively, and this is how you handle the control init. So the same function, difference between VB and C#. David is asking, how does security logins fit into the ViewState? David, I'm not sure security logins fit into ViewState at all. ViewState is an orthogonal issue to security logins. Let's look at it from the following perspective. Let's say, for example, you effectively have a page that you have to decide whether Fred is going to be able to view that page or not. Well, that is actually handled in the load event. You could call another function like authorize and say, I'm not going to display this page, and I'm going to simply redirect to another page, because something like a forbidden page, because this user does not have access to that page. So in that case, when you go to that other page, there is no concept of ViewState that has anything to do with this, because you're now displaying a completely different page saying, Fred, you don't have access to the show categories table page that you originally requested. Let me show you this other page. You may want to log in. You may want to do other things effectively. And in the case of specific authorization, meaning that Control X is visible or Control X is not, Y is not visible, and so on, you simply set the visible flag of that based on the various roles or based on the various users, and ViewState basically will not contain those values in it by default effectively in there. But do keep in mind that if you add your own things to ViewState, you may have to do some extra precautions in that. John is asking, can you show me an example of an IronSpeed Designer generated app that uses a stored procedure that I may have written myself? John, I'm not going to be able to show you an example in this webinar. We were primarily focused on the .NET code model. But if you go to the Customize menu, and I think the other gentleman asked about the web service, this is where it's in the Customize Code Customization Wizard. And if you open up that Customization Wizard, and let me make this larger, go to the next button, and you will see, and I'm going to collapse the tree over here so you can see the high-level things. Here is the web services section over here, and here is the stored procedures section over here. This is where you will see essentially where you can do your own add records with your own database stored procedures, populate grid view with your own database stored procedures, and so on. And it gives you exactly the code that will be inserted for you, but you can also use this code and essentially do this. If your application is VB.NET, this code will be in VB.NET rather than in C#. So the Customize Wizard is where I would direct you to in order to get that information. Hitesh is asking, in which page event should one create dynamic controls? A very good question, Hitesh. A very appropriate question for the web, for the .NET code model, effectively. The best place to create dynamic controls is actually in the load event before you actually load any of the database. The reason for this is the following. The init event is primarily sent in order to handle all of the controls that you have defined statically on the particular page. So you want to take advantage of all of that definition has already been done, and now you need to effectively handle the load event in order to do it. Now you can make an argument that you can call the init, when the init event handler is called, you call the mybase.init or base.init if it was C#, and then do your work. So it's 6 of one, half dozen of another. Essentially, you want to do it post-init, pre-load, and the best way that I recommend is usually do it in essentially the load event as the first thing effectively. All right, Steve is asking, new pages do not have a load event, while IronSpeed created pages have a load tab. I put page load code in load data, while other pages I put code into control load section. Is there a best practice for doing things on page load? Thanks. Steve, the issue about using either the load at a control level, or meaning that at the table control or record control, or at the page level, is not an issue of essentially, really what is an issue of is essentially to see where the localized data is. So you want to do it at the lowest level possible rather than doing it at the highest level. If you do it at the highest level, you're making it very general. So if you can do the same code at the record control or the table control, we would recommend doing it at that level rather than at the page level, because you have access to more data at the lower level. At the higher level, you have to search for the low level to find it. At the lower level, you can always go up to the parent and get data from the page class without having to do too much work effectively, right? So let's say, for example, if you have a page which is showing a table, inside of the table you have multiple rows. So if you want to do certain thing at a particular row level, obviously doing it at the page level requires you to find that specific row. Is it row number 1, row number 2, row number 3? Which row is it, right? But if you do it at the row level, which is the lowest level possible, then you already have access to that row data. And that allows you to effectively say, okay, I can operate, I can say, what's the first name for this row? and based on that, I make some decision effectively. Okay. Prakayat also is asking, do we have to save data in the ViewState, or .NET does it automatically? The answer to that is .NET does it automatically, but .NET is overly aggressive in saving as much data as you want in the ViewState. So what you may have to do is you may have to turn off the ViewState in certain cases effectively. So if you go to, like, let's say, for example, the page, if you look at the properties section effectively over here, then let me see if I have a description field over here. Where did it go? There's a place here where you can essentially turn off ViewState. Oh, there you go, enable ViewState. That you have the ability to turn that on or off. This is, enable ViewState is a standard .NET property for every control, and you can turn it on or off. Normally, or by default, it is always turned on effectively. So now, we actually do not recommend you turn this off unless you are very familiar with ViewState, because if you turn it off, you will get some weird behavior, especially if the user is going to next page, previous page, and things of that nature, because ViewState is actually used by .NET, but it actually automatically gets handled by .NET for you. Raji is asking, if I have business logic that I would like to implement within a database stored procedure, and I would like to execute the stored procedure, passing values from the UI, would it be best to implement on a click event? I guess my real question is how to use custom stored procedures with Iron Speed. Well, depending on what your stored procedure is trying to accomplish. For example, is your stored procedure actually doing the addition or deletion or of records, or is it trying to do certain other things like I'm not sure, maybe underneath the hood it's adding some additional records or things of that nature effectively. You can simply pass essentially parameters to the stored procedures. Remember, we talked about here how to go into the code customization wizard and look at the stored procedures. Let's say add records. Let me take add records as a great example, because add records needs to pass the data effectively, right? So if you look here, there is a stored procedure parameter effectively that is available to you over here, and this is how you would pass it for employee first name John. I mean, of course, these are hard-coded values here, but there's nothing stopping you from saying me.firstname.text as an example, instead of hard-coding John or Smith or whatever else the case might be. So this is how you would effectively specify the stored procedure parameters and use it. Now, remember that this code that you're seeing over here shows it, in fact, how you would essentially call a standard way to call essentially all of the stored procedures and use the existing connection that you already have available. But there's nothing stopping you from writing your own custom code to call that stored procedure using standard, any of the standard .NET libraries or anything else that you might have effectively. In fact, what this does is it actually uses underneath the hood the standard .NET library anyway. Okay, John is asking, does a SQL Server money data type presented on the UI with a $xxx.xxs format automatically from the Iron Speed Designer build application? Absolutely, John. We automatically recognize that money data type on that, and we will actually automatically create the appropriate data type inside of Iron Speed Designer in order to handle that. Remember that when you come into the databases section and you look at, let's say, for example, products has a unit price as an example, Iron Speed automatically recognizes that and shows you as a currency. Of course, you have an opportunity to change that if you don't think that that is appropriate. You can change that to a number, a percentage, a string, and things like that. But Iron Speed Designer automatically recognizes that and also creates a display format for you there as well. You are an active bunch. I have another 20 or 25 questions that have shown up over here while I was speaking. Let me get a sip of water, and I will answer all of your questions. I'm going to stay as long as possible. It's 8:55, so 5 minutes to the top of the hour, but I'll stay as long and answer all of your questions, especially about .NET-related code model, but also a few of Iron Speed Designer as well. Okay. Prakayat is asking, how much .NET class knowledge is required to design apps with Iron Speed Designer? Prakash, a very good question. The answer to that question is depends on how much code customizations you need to do. In general, if you're building essentially a standard off-the-shelf application where if IronSpeed gives you pretty much everything that you need in order to be able to add, delete, slice and dice the data, and so on and so forth, you actually don't need any knowledge of .NET classes. But if you're going in and actually doing some additional things, like let's say, for example, if you want to merge a library with digital signatures, as an example, into your application, then obviously you would need some amount of knowledge of .NET classes in order to be able to do that. You've got 100% of the source code of the application, so you can essentially do as much or as little. It's up to you really in that respect. To create, our goal is that you should only need to go to .NET classes for specific or special or extra things effectively. Standard off-the-shelf type of things you should be able to do within IronSpeed Designer as well as using formulas. Okay, Robert is asking, is there any way to do the following? Two users read the same record almost concurrently. One user changes data to the amount field of the record and saves the record. Meanwhile, the second user changes the amount field to a different amount. The second user saves the data. Is there any way that IronSpeed has the ability to tell the second user that the data has changes since he or she read the initial record? Robert, IronSpeed Designer handles this issue automatically if you use stored procedures. So what I would suggest is you look at concurrency and the online help on concurrency, and it talks about essentially this exact issue. So here's user 1, here's user 2. It's postal code in this example, not the amount. But you can see essentially what happens. Record saved, record not saved. And if you look here, let me see if I can. So you can say, cannot update customers while you are editing. Another user updated the same record you are modifying. We recommend you cancel this edit and start the edit process again with the updated information effectively. This is called optimistic concurrency, and this is handled automatically by IronSpeed Designer if you're using stored procedures, basically. So this online help will tell you exactly what we do effectively in terms of this thing. So Microsoft Access concurrency handling is not supported. SQL Server, here's the thing, essentially. SQL Server 7, here's the thing. Oracle 9 ISD, here's the details on that, basically. Okay. Ramesh is asking, is hands-on training available at your facility for project manager level personnel, non-programmer? Ramesh, hands-on training at our facility is not available. We do offer a number of webinars like this one and others in order to do training as well. But I also encourage you to look at other things on the start page of the application. As an example, I believe that there is, I forget what, you know, we have a number of our MVPs as well that offer some of these training. Oh, there you go. This is what I was trying to talk about. Live from Las Vegas. Akesh Gupta, one of our MVPs, is hosting a 2-day training course, which is a hands-on training course effectively in Las Vegas from February 22nd and 23rd. So take advantage of something like that, for example. But you can also attend all of the different webinars and so on that we offer. You might want to talk to your account manager or your sales representative about this thing, because they can give you all of the different options that are available in this respect here. John is asking, please show me how to drag and drop and add customer panel on a page layout. Very easy to do. Here is a show categories table. I can add a new row here. This may not be the most appropriate place to add that. I can merge some of these cells together, for example, and then I can go to the panels toolbox, and I may, let's say, for example, I want to add a products thing. So here is an add record, and I drag and drop and add record. And it asks me some questions, but I can just go ahead and press finish over here. The add record panel gets added. Now keep in mind that the spreadsheet grid allows you to zoom in or zoom out at different levels. So right now, the products record is zoomed out effectively. If you double click it, it'll zoom in. And in fact, if you look at the hierarchy over here, right now we're showing at the categories field level, but I can go all the way to products field over here and zoom into the specific products field area. So where you've got a label field, label field, 2-column display over here. 2 columns meaning label field in one column, label field in another column. That's what I mean by two-column display. So that's how easy it is to drag and drop a panel in IronSpeed Designer. David is asking filtering best practices. I think I don't want to return any records till the search criteria is entered. I have a search screen with several filters that takes a long time to render, but the view it's based on runs very quickly to return records at the SQL Server level. I'm trying to figure out what can I do to speed up the page load in IronSpeed. It takes 20 to 30 seconds. The total number of records returned is only a few thousand, but the view hits several tables. David, there are a couple of things. First of all, there is a page type called I forget what it's called, search and show, as an example. What it does basically is it search and edit and search and show record and so on. What it does is it initially starts off not showing the data until somebody searches for something effectively. So that way the data is not displayed until and unless that actually data is displayed. There's also, you can also do what's called hide until search. There is a value that you can set effectively. Let me go back on the show categories table. Let's go back to the categories table. So here's my table control. You see where it says hide until search, false by default. So at the table control level, you can set this to true, in which case the data is not displayed until the user searches it effectively. So that's how easy it is for you to do the first part of your question. Second part of your question, why does it take so long to load? Keep in mind that when you are loading the data, you may be sorting or searching and filtering in a variety of different criteria that are not indexed in the database. Our suggestion is, this space is cheap these days. I was looking at, you can get a 2 terabyte drive for less than $100 these days. So why not index every field in your database that you have? Just go ahead and index them. That will improve your performance 100x effectively if you index as many of the fields that are available to you in your database. And also, by the way, on the online help, I recommend looking at some of the performance things, improving application performance, and I'll give you a lot of hints basically on what you can do. Brian is asking, how should we add caching for things commonly reused like key value pair, drop-down lists? Brian, IronSpeed Designer automatically caches the data for you at the lowest level, at the data access layer, so you generally don't have to worry about caching yourself in doing that. But if you are doing a standard .NET application, I would suggest you use the enterprise cache blocks that are available in .NET effectively and add essentially key value pairs into the enterprise cache block effectively. Just search online for enterprise cache block and you'll know what I'm talking about. And this is what we use effectively in order to essentially handle caching. It does all of the least recently used and all of the things that you might imagine in order to flush the code, flush the cache out if it gets filled. But that's what you would use effectively in order to do your caching. Hal is asking, what is the quickest and best way to learn how to extend and override the IronSpeed API classes, methods, etc.? A few things basically. Number one is, this may be something, by the way, Hal, that you might check with your account manager and sales rep. There are a number of resources that we have that we can guide you towards. So rather than answering it here, my suggestion is I would like you to suggest contacting your sales rep, and we can give you, training resources, video resources, live webinar resources, documentation resources, and so on. So we've got a tremendous amount of information available to you that you can use. So I suggest you talk to your sales rep on that one. Dhruv is asking, can you demonstrate any simple application? I'm new to IronSpeed. I could, but let me wait till near the end if you don't mind, because a lot of people have a number of other questions here that I'd like to answer them. But also, I encourage you to attend a number of other webinars. One of the next webinars that we have coming up is actually an advanced one tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning, California time. But also one at 8 a.m. on Friday, which is the Getting Started webinar, and that will go through essentially how to create a simple application in IronSpeed Designer. I suggest that you actually strongly recommend that you attend that one. I think that will give you a lot more information rather than me showing it over here. Also suggest you talk to the sales rep as well and see if they can guide you some additional things as well. James is asking, are link and entity framework selectable options for data access layer in addition to IronSpeed's own data access layer implementation? James, currently they are not. Link and entity framework are not options. We generate the data access layer directly in our case effectively. It's 6 of one, half dozen of another effectively. It's not a big deal effectively whether you use one or the other effectively. It's something that we have looked at in the past. And in fact went through a lot of work on the entity framework and so on, but decided that that's probably not something that we would do immediately, but something we might do in the future. Eric is asking, I want to be able to capture audit information associated with viewing a record, that is Active Directory user, date, time, view name, record number in the view. Whenever a record is requested for viewing, and take the 4 pieces of information, populate them as a record in an audit table I add to the database. How do I put this code in only one place to be called for view handling events for each record? The best way to do that, Eric, this is a much more detailed technical question. I suggest that you come to the webinar. I believe that tomorrow's webinar is on formulas, right? Actually, I forgot. So that is it's on custom stored procedures. I apologize for that. The thing that I would recommend, and oh, by the way, for those of you who are asking about custom stored procedures, attend tomorrow's webinar that I'm doing at 8 o'clock, and we'll walk through that thing. But in terms of there are many ways of doing it in formulas. Again, I would recommend this is actually fairly easy to do. The place that I would direct you to do is to go through the customization wizard and specifically look at the audit trail examples over there. But we can get you additional help in support or on the forum as well. If you have support, that's probably the best way to do that. Philippe is asking, why can't I open a site developed with IronSpeed Designer with Visual Studio 2010 Ultimate? I always have a conversion error because of the framework. Philippe, I think the reason for that is you're using .NET 3.5. My suggestion is you use .NET 4.0, but you should be able to open up your application in Visual 2010 without any problem, as long as you use Visual Studio 2010 and .NET 4.0. The gentleman who was asking about doing set fields on insert and update, this is the code that you want to override, insert and update, and do your own work over here and add as much code as you want to save it into an audit table. Can I call HW like COM ports from the code behind file? Trond is asking. I don't know what you're asking, Trond, over here. Can I call hardware like COM ports from code behind file? I think that's what you're asking. Can you call COM ports from the code behind file? Trond, I think there is one major misconception about web applications. Web applications, at the end of the day, are designed so that you can run it on a browser effectively. So what COM port are you talking about? Are you talking about the end user's COM port, or are you talking about the server's COM port? Well, I think this is maybe a limitation more of the web technology and .NET. If you can do it in .NET, to be honest with you, I don't know the answer to this question, but if you can do it in .NET, end users, COM ports, Tron, I guess you're saying that to Jill, the answer to that is I seriously doubt if you can open up the COM ports of end user's machine with using web technology. It doesn't really matter. It has nothing to do with IronSpeed Designer, Tron. I doubt if .NET allows you to do that. Would be a security hole. Imagine, for example, you go hit www.amazon.com and Amazon opens up the COM port and starts sending data through the COM port on your machine. That would be a huge security hole. This is not a IronSpeed Designer limitation or issue. It's really, I doubt even it's a .NET or a Microsoft issue. It's probably just a browser issue. You cannot open up the hard disk things or anything of an end user's machine. Hitesh is asking, can you can you throw some light on auto event wire up attribute in page directive essentially? Hitesh, I'm not sure I understand this event myself completely, so I'm not sure I can give you a whole bunch of additional information that you might not be able to find on Google directly. The issue essentially it's essentially the ability for you to hook up the handles keyword directly or not, but it's something that you may have to search online. I'm not sure I understand it completely myself. Ram is asking, most of IronSpeed generated apps are towards modifying a single table of data. How do you recommend designing a complex page that updates multiple tables from one user page? Ram, very easy. We have the concept of essentially a query. You can do many ways. For example, you can define a view, but there's nothing stopping you. Keep in mind, Ram, the basic thing, I think we actually may be doing ourselves a disservice by essentially doing an application wizard that quickly creates an application from all of the tables and views you have. That is just a starting point. Doesn't necessarily mean that that is the be-all and the end-all. Let's go back over here on the customer stable control effectively that I have, or category stable control that I have. I can right mouse click over here, go to the query, go to the from area, and add as many things as I want. So I can say I want to join categories and products together over here. And automatically links the two together. Products.category ID equal categories.category ID. So you can do as many joins as you want right here. And not all of the where clauses and every functionality may be available from the where clause, but certainly you can do that as a view in your database as well. And if that does not help, you can also write some custom code as well in order to accomplish that. But there's nothing stopping you from doing things that I just showed you over here, which is joining multiple tables together. In fact, IronSpeed Designer is smart enough to realize the foreign key relationships and give you the where clause without you having to do any work. Okay, water break. Okay, Sabarish is asking how to set role configuration at component level at IronSpeed Designer 5.2. I did it by right-click on the component on the page and choosing its security, but that's still visible, that control on the page, and when the unauthorized user clicks on that, it says that the user was not authorized. My question here is how to make that unauthorized components visible false instead of redirecting it to another page and say they are not authorized. Sabarish, first of all, 5.2 support has ended a while ago. And in fact, I don't even remember how it's done in 5.2. It's a 3 or 3.5-year-old version in here. The scenario that you're describing doesn't sound right. If you set up a component level security using IronSpeed Designer, it automatically sets the visible flag of that to false when the user criteria is not met effectively, or the authorization criteria is not met effectively. So you must be doing something wrong there, but I cannot tell you just from the description over here exactly what may be happening over there. But as I mentioned to you, we no longer provide support for 5.2, so I'm not sure I can really help you on that at this point in time. You may want to check with your account manager on your options available there. Laszlo is asking, is it possible to integrate into IronSpeed XML pages and render with XSLT? The answer, Laszlo, is absolutely you can do that. At the end of the day, Laszlo, keep in mind that there are certain things that we do very well, but other things, we give you essentially the full 100% of the source code. So there's nothing stopping you essentially going in and opening this up in Visual Studio and adding an XML and XSLT page effectively with much ease. There's no problem in doing that. I can just open this up in Visual Studio here. And I can just open this up in Visual Studio and add another page with XML, and that's all there is to it. That's what we try to give you. Is we try to give you 100% of the source code. So here's an example. I can go in on the categories table, add new item. What new item do I want? I want another web page, web class, master page. You've got all of the other, everything that you might imagine that's available to you, and the Visual Studio is available to you. Just add that page and go from there. The parts that we do very well we'll take care of it. The parts that we don't do, rather than giving you some sub-level performance on that, we say just open it up in Visual Studio and do those portions. So if you can get 80% of your application developed through IronSpeed Designer and have the 5, 10, 15, 20% done in Visual Studio, I think we have been very successful in that if we can accomplish 80 to 90% of your application right out of the box. Muhammad is asking, does IronSpeed Designer cache data return from the database? If yes, how can I read that cache data? Muhammad, IronSpeed Designer does cache data from the database. And no, you do not have an option on how to read that cache data yourself. You do have an opportunity. IronSpeed Designer will automatically use that cache for you, so you don't have to worry about that. The cache is at a very low level in base classes at the data access layer. We recommend you not go around doing anything with that. You have been an active bunch. It's 9:15 here, but I still have about 15 questions or 20 questions, and more are coming. So I will answer all of the questions for you. So do keep them coming as long as my voice holds. Dan is asking, how can you make a little modification to a file without restarting all the app and losing session state? Something you can do with a classic app. First of all, Dan, you cannot do that even with a classic app. It's not an issue of IronSpeed Designer, to be honest with you, Dan. It's an issue of how .NET works effectively, right? If you change the bin folder, or the web.config file, or the app_code folder, or the app_data folder, your application will be restarted by IIS. There's nothing IronSpeed Designer can do to stop that from happening effectively. Okay, so if this is an issue for IIS and Microsoft, nothing that I can do to change that effectively. Okay, so if you are losing session state, then the best thing you may want to consider is store the session state in the database so that it's not lost effectively. But you know, I find the question a little bit odd, Dan, simply because I wouldn't think that you would want to change the engines on a plane while you are in the air. I think you want to essentially make sure that the plane lands first before you make the changes to the engine, essentially. So my suggestion, don't change it in flight. You should not be making those changes for a production app in the way that you're articulating over there. At least I would not do that. You know, and I would strongly recommend against that. Reese is asking, in web.config, can we encrypt the connection string info to prevent keeping the database password in plain text? Reese, you can. There is some online help on that one, I believe, so you may want to search for that. But by default, you cannot encrypt that, but there may be a code customizations that you can do in order to do the encryption there. Ram is asking, in web.config, oh, I think that was the question that Reese was asking, or maybe, I don't know exactly who asked that question, but that's the same question. Prakayat is asking, once I build an app with IronSpeed Designer, can I modify code with IronSpeed Designer interface? Absolutely, you can. We expect you, any application that is living and breathing and that lives, we expect you to make 3 types of changes. We expect your database schema to change. New tables are added, fields are deleted, fields are added, fields are renamed, data types are changed, and so on. That's why we give you database synchronization. We do a great job of handling the database synchronization, if I can say that myself here. So that we expect you to do. We expect you to change the layout, and you can do that on the spreadsheet grid. You can move, copy, you know, you can do anything. All of these are preserved for you. Doesn't really matter. You can make as many changes as you want, and these are preserved for you as long as you want them, even through migrations to other versions. And the third thing is we make changes to the code, and the same thing with the code changes. Those are preserved for you as long as you follow our recommended practice, which is put that in section 1 in the code. Richard is asking, how do you get the coming attraction into your start page? I think those coming, you already answered that. Is that right? Okay. Got it. I see. Yes. if you restart IRSP Designer, you should see the start page refreshed and show you that as long as you're connected to the internet, you should see the coming attraction showing up there. I think you can probably just right mouse click and refresh probably if you want to get the latest ones in here. Sheldon is asking, how does IRSP deal with HTTP post-back of payment transaction for the payment service provider? Would code be required to handle the variables returned to display the info on screen and store the variables in the database? Sheldon, yes. All of the post-back from payment transaction that you're doing, you're probably doing it from the server, not from the client. And in that case, you would need to essentially retrieve that data and essentially save that data into the database at that. So imagine, for example, somebody has the place order button. You would essentially handle the click handler for the place order. You would essentially send the appropriate post of the data, and then you would essentially parse the response back and store it into your database and then return back. So you would normally, typical way to do this thing is to do it in your click handler for the place order button as an example. Muhammad is asking, can I populate the show table control with my custom stored procedure? And if so, which code function should be overridden to do that? Muhammad, you cannot use a custom stored procedure to populate our show table control. You can use a custom stored procedure to populate a grid view, and that example exists in the code customization wizard example there under stored procedures. The reason why you cannot populate the custom stored procedure, use the custom stored procedure for a show table control is because we do a number of different things that are not necessarily provided by your custom stored procedure. For example, we enable export, we enable import, we enable PDF report, we enable Word report, we enable Excel report, we enable add, edit, all kinds of things, for example. We do not allow you to populate that custom stored procedure, populate that show table control from the custom stored procedure. But the example, populate grid view, is, so here's an example, populate grid view with your own database stored procedure. You can make this look exactly like our table control if you like, and in fact, we will give you an example of doing that thing. And I will show this tomorrow in tomorrow's webinar at 8 a.m. Okay, Joe is asking, what are the main differences, if any, between page lifecycle, event sequence, or overall architecture of a show table page versus an add edit screen? Generally, in terms of page lifecycle, there is no difference, effectively, Joe. The page lifecycle still does the same thing. You've got the init, the load, the pre-render, effectively. The difference in between the show table and an add edit screen, effectively, comes in the event handlers, which have to do with the user action. When the user presses the save button, that's when all of the magic of an add and edit page differs from the show table page. Displaying the data in a text box versus a literal, there is really no difference, effectively, from that perspective. So there's really no difference in the page lifecycle of a show page versus an add edit page, effectively, in there. The only difference is really in the post-back event handling of the save button in that sense. Now, obviously, at the lower level, there may be some other minor changes, but I'm giving you kind of at the high level, there's literally no difference in terms of what you can do. To be honest with you, Joe, there is really no difference in the way that we think of an add page versus an edit page versus a show page. The only difference, if you really think about it, is whether that data gets displayed in a text box or a literal. So if you've got a first name field, what makes it into an add or edit page? Well, if it's a text box or a drop-down list or a radio button or a checkbox, that's considered an add page. If it's a literal or a label, it's considered a show page. In fact, a lot of times what happens is that people say, you know what, I want a quote-unquote add page which only edits one field as an example, or an edit page which only edits one field as an example. It changes just the status. So there's a status drop-down. It changes, approved or not approved. Well, and the rest of the page, I want to display that expense report as an example, right? So what's the difference between, is that an edit page or a show page? Well, it's both. It's a show page for most of the information except the status field, and the status field is an edit. So what's the difference in terms terms of the underlying code, the only difference is on the in the ASPX, one control is a drop-down versus a literal. And in the code behind, you have an extra save function. That's all the difference there is. Okay, let me take some more water here. Michael is asking, with Iron Speed Designer support Google Chrome, several sites now shy away from IE due to issues. You know, I'm using Google Chrome myself, and I've been using Google Chrome for a long time over here, as you can see here. So the answer is, as you can imagine, if I'm using Google Chrome, we do support Google Chrome. Joe is asking, is there a way to have display format for a field also enforce user data input either the way masked edit screen does or as an automated validation? I'm trying to understand your question, Joe. Is there a way to have the display format for a field also enforce user data input either the way the masked edit screen does or as an automated validation? Joe, the display format is only for displaying purposes, not for validating effectively in there. You have the ability to use a mask control. In fact, there is a, if you go to the ASP tags here and look up Ajax, there is a masked edit that is available to you. So let's go to, I don't know, add customers, and I have, let's say, a phone number. I can go ahead and add a masked edit over here, and then go to the cell editor. And what I will do is, instead of this text box, enter, no, the label and the text box is not needed. The masked edit is essentially going to target control ID will be changed to phone over here, and this will show, you know, 999, 999-9999. And hopefully that, I think the mask type is, I don't know exactly what the mask type is. I'm not familiar with this mask edit control myself, but this mask edit extender you can attach effectively to any control that exists. So here, excuse me. So here, as an example, the target control ID is the phone control effectively over here. But you know, you can see how to do that. That's fairly easy to do. Mahendra is asking, which folder in your PC is the download application once executed is stored? Example, I downloaded job application, but I could not find the folder but or open from the file open. Generally, Mahendra, if your job application has been downloaded using the installer for that application, it goes into the same folder as Iron Speed Designer is installed, most likely in your program files folder. So in my case, for example, I install it in my releases folder, and I've got all of these different releases here. But notice that, oh, I don't have sample applications installed over here, but it would be in program files /ironspeed/designer v711/ you know, sample application. So it'll end up here in this folder. Okay, last about 5 questions over here, and I think that will also be a last call for questions over here. We are at 9:30. As I mentioned, I will answer all of your questions, but please do get this is the last call for your questions, so we can. I need to give my voice a rest over here. Brian is asking, I have a database table with 2 additional columns, created by and created date, which should be auto-populated upon insert only. How do I do this in Iron Speed without a lot of customization? Brian, you literally don't need to make any customization at all. You can just simply go to that add particular page over here. Let me give you an example. We actually have something like this on an add employees page. There is the, no, actually I don't have that here. But let's say, for example, no, where is it? Add, maybe it's on add orders. There you go, created by. So all you need to do is on the add page, go to the formulas effectively, and you basically, in this case, the created by and updated by, and on the created on, and essentially initialize when adding a record. And then say what you need to do basically is essentially instead of say, you can effectively hide this control. There are many ways of doing it. Excuse me. Initialize when adding the record. When adding the record, right mouse click this, set to functions, date and time now. And so this field will now be initialized to the current time. This is on the created on the add page. Now you effectively, when this page is saved, the created date will take on the current time. Now you may want to basically go in and change this field type from being a text box to a literal, so that the user does not change that, as an example, right? There you go. That's all you need to do in order to save the created date. You do the same thing on created by. On the created by, you may want to essentially go through right mouse click, functions, security, and user ID or username, depending on what exactly you're looking for. Let's say user ID. Change this thing from a drop-down list to a literal, and now those two fields are initialized by the created on and created by, and when the save button is pressed, they'll be done. No code customization, everything just done in formulas. Mahendra is asking, please give example how to create customized field as search field. Mahendra, you can put as many search fields as you want. So here's a show orders table as an example. I'll go to the search area, orders filters area. Here's my existing search field. But then I can go through, and let me go back to the toolbox over here, show the toolbox. If I go to the filters, I can add a search filter over here, and here's a search. And then if I go back to the properties over here, I will see that automatic type ahead, where did it go? Oh, search fields right here. And I can basically say, this particular search field, I only want to search, I don't know, ship address, but I don't want to search all of these other ones effectively, as an example. So this is the way that I can now have an address search field. I can go back to the filters. I can go back and drag and drop another search field. This particular search field, I can then go through and change that to essentially say, in this particular case, this search field is not being from the address, but instead it will be the city. So this is how you can have as many search fields. So search in the city, search in the country, search in the address, whatever the case might be. That's how easy it is for you to add your own search fields. You can, of course, delete the additional buttons that get created here, and you might want to change the label to say search address or whatever else the case might be. Okay, last call for questions. I won't take any more questions after this. I've got 5 questions over here, and I'll answer them. James is asking, are all of these functionalities available in the trial version? I currently have IronSuite version 5.2 and will update to V7 on June or July after our budget pass. James, all the functionality that I'm showing you is available in version 7. But keep in mind that if you can only look at some of the functionality if you are using a sample database. So you will be able to look at all of the enterprise edition features if you use a sample database. Otherwise, you will only get the trial edition features effectively. But you can try out the enterprise edition features very easily by using the Southwind database. Michael is asking, in regard to the large list selector, if I want to disable but show the selected value of a drop-down list that has a large list selector button, I cannot find a way to disable the large list selector list button when the corresponding field is disabled. If I use the security feature, the field and the large list selector both are set to not visible. Michael, this may be a question for support. If you have support, I suggest you open up a support case. I'm not sure I can answer that because I don't quite know all of the details over here. Or if you don't have support, open up a forum. Do recommend touching base with your account manager to get additional options there. James is asking, how do you add a JavaScript on-change event to a text box control in a table control? James, very easy. You've got a, let's say, show employees table over here. I'm assuming it's an edit table, basically, right? Edit employees table, because that's what requires a text box. So I have a first name field. I believe you can simply go to custom properties and then type on change. And I don't know the syntax of this thing, James, so I may be doing this from memory. JavaScript, alert, I am here. Something like that, I think, is what works effectively. So try that, and so any attribute that you specify, you can specify that on the custom properties here. Okay. I have actually on that on change thing. Let's see, on change. I don't know if there's an online help. There you go. On change. So since most of the circular factor, there you go. On change don't fall, so 2 would conflict. Okay, it's about something else. But the idea is, actually, here's an example. No, there's not an example there. Oops. Let me go back over here. Knowledge base. On change. Online help. Yeah, I don't remember exactly, but that's something like that what you would handle. Edward is saying, I have same question on coming events on ISV start page. Even though I refresh my 711 enterprise start page and I'm connected to internet, it does not show the coming events. Edward, I do not know why that is the case. I'll take a look at that and see what may be happening over there. Thank you so much for pointing that out. I'll make sure that gets addressed effectively. I believe you can go to IronSpeed/start page to see the coming attractions as well. Okay. David is asking, when you sign in using database authentication, when you sign in using database authentication, it signs you into default page, and when you click on the different tab on the menu, it prompts to sign in page again. When you sign in using database authentication, it signs you into the default page, and when you click on different tab on the menu, it prompts to sign in again. David, this sounds like some kind of problem or maybe a configuration issue. I won't be able to debug this in the webinar over here. This is a typical support question that you might open up a support case or post it on the forum if you don't have support. Talk to your account manager or sales rep to see if they can guide you towards the right thing. I don't know what exactly is happening. Probably requires a little bit more time than what I can do it on the webinar. Brian is asking, if there is time, how can we optimize for browser sizes that is 1024 by 768? Brian, our applications normally are designed effectively, when we create the teams, are designed actually for the 1024 by 768 by default anyway. So normally, if you were to go in and essentially look at the application, while it will take up all of the width of the application and all of the height, but as you resize it, you will see that it gets resized up to a limit. So notice exactly that it stops resizing and shows the browser browser scroll bar at the bottom effectively. We do this normally anyway. So if you're having something different than that, a different experience in your mind effectively, there is a page width option that's available to you. Again, I don't remember exactly, so let me see if I can search for that. If I go to, there you go, set application page width, there's a little bit of help in there. You might want to look at that and see what you can do in order to play around with that. If you've got additional questions, go ahead and do contact support in doing that. It's about 9:39 a.m. here in California. Hope you benefit from that. That was the last question. So thank you so much for joining us today. Do, as I mentioned, visit the start page. If you don't find it in IronSpeed Designer, go to ironspeed.com/start page and view that, and it'll tell you all of the goodies that we have in terms of webinars. We have a webinar tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. also, and this is related to custom stored procedures, and we have another webinar on Friday at 8 a.m., and that's on the getting started. So do join us for that as well. And look forward to seeing you at a future webinar.